Hello and welcome to this video going through Act 3 of Inspector Calls. So we've seen Act 2 ends with the tension being released as we finally realise that Eric is the father of Eva Smith's illegitimate child, and Mrs. Burling, who is so keen to avoid responsibility, she has kind of thrown her own son under the bus. It all comes to a head at Act 3. And of course Eric re-enters here. And this idea, the family are unpicking this as well. Mrs. Burling is kind of completely oblivious to the fact that her son doesn't get drunk. She doesn't know so much about her children in the same way that her husband doesn't either. Sheila starts to support the inspector here in this idea, if you had any sense of loyalty. And it's interesting that Sheila's sense of loyalty from the point of her interrogation forwards, is to the truth rather than her parents. It's to socialism and honesty rather than to capitalist greed and selfishness there as we go through. And they reach a point here where the inspector undermines Mr. Burling to say that Eric can have a drink. This idea, he's more of a father figure and he understands that drink is important at the right time here. If someone's had a shock, they'll often have a whiskey there as well. And this idea that Eric is used to quick, heavy drinking as well. So we reach a point here where obviously we hear Eric's story with Eva Smith. What's quite interesting here, Eric was in the state where a chap easily turns nasty and I threaten to make a row. It's quite an interesting point here, I suppose. Obviously, we would potentially call this rape. We would certainly call it sexual assault in 2023. And to a modern audience there, they would kind of understand this. I think at the time in 1945, there's a little bit of ambiguity here as well. What happens is Eric certainly is in a state where a chap easily turns nasty, so he becomes aggressive to Eva Smith, and I threaten to make a row, which is quite a childish statement. I'm going to make a fuss, I'm going to make a row, I'm going to start shouting in the street unless you let me have sex with you. And this idea, and as in a state where a chap easily turns nasty, even if it's not rape that he is guilty of, which he probably would be in a modern audience, this idea that first of all, he is forcing Eva Smith to do something she doesn't want to. She consents to keep him quiet, really, to stop there being a scandal or to stop there being a problem. And also, Eric is probably unlikely to be tried by a court. This idea it would be Eric, the son of Mr. Burling, the future brother-in-law of Gerald Croft, against Eva Smith, a woman from the underclass, Daisy Renton. What her name is at this stage, we don't really know. So I think it's quite important. I would certainly talk in terms of sexual assault or in terms of Eric forcing himself upon Eva Smith. But whether we would kind of go, and I understand why people call it that in a modern audience, but I think it's an important distinction to make there as well. And this idea, that's when it happened. I didn't even remember, that's the hellish thing. Oh my God, how stupid it all is. That's his exclamation there. How stupid it all is. That's when it happened. He sexually abused her. He's got her pregnant as a result of a drunken one-night stand there. And he now tries to avoid any responsibility there. This idea that Sheila is escorted there. Interesting that Sheila's protected but not Eva Smith. And then Eric. Yes, I wasn't in love with her or anything, but I liked her. She was pretty and a good sport. The word pretty has been used so many times to refer to women in the novel. It's this idea of objectification of women in Inspector Calls. They're treated as objects. They're not treated as real people. And a good sport as well. This idea that she's just seen purely as an object for sex, for Eric's sexual gratification. He believes he has a right to have sex with her because he's a member of the upper class. He can force her to do whatever she wants. And actually, his objectification of women, his behaviour is completely reprehensible. And he doesn't care about Eva Smith as a person. He just wants to use her for sex. And his response is still quite childish here. I'm old enough to be married, aren't I? And I'm not married. And I hate these fat old tarts around town, the ones I see some of your respectable friends with. It's interesting in the film version, they kind of, there's more of a relationship between Eric and Eva here, but actually Eric really does just use her for sex. And he's still quite childish here. Of course, she was worried about it because she was going to have a baby. I was in a hell of a state about it. It's still selfishness here, still childishness. Well, I was upset about it. What about her? I was upset about it, but she's dead. She said I didn't love her and all that. In a way, she treats me as if I were a kid, though I was nearly as old as she was. Again, a childish response because he behaves like a child. He takes no responsibility. He has got drunk. He has forced himself on a woman. He's had sex with her and made her pregnant. He's committed so many moral crimes and potentially legal crimes in that instance, and he's still behaving like a child here. And then the legal crime, stealing the money. He took £50 on top of drinking and going around the town. £50 from the company's accounts. He stole the money. Not what do you mean, not really. He's guilty of theft, but it's also the way he does this. It's kind of a form of fraud. So what he does, going through here, we'll kind of find out here. Mr. Burling gave the firm's receipt and then kept the money. So what he does is he goes to collect accounts. So a bit like if you have a window cleaner, they'll clean the windows. They might do that when you're out of the house, and then they come and say, "Oh, by the way, I cleaned your windows. You owe me £10 for that." That's kind of what Eric does. So he goes to some people who've had some trading with Burling Company, say, "Oh, you owe us £200 for this work we've done for you. Give me the £200. Then what he does is obviously steal the money. So he steals £50 worth. I think we worked out it would be something in the thousands of pounds in a kind of in modern kind of market there as well. And Burling is trying to cover up Eric. Really, actually, he's trying to cover up himself because Burling himself is implicated in this scandal. If it gets out that actually his son has been stealing money through fraud from the Burling Company, he is going to be liable for that. His company is going to be in trouble. And it's interesting, Eric responds with, "You're not the kind of father a chap could go to when he's in trouble. That's why." A key quotation for Eric, because this is what Mr. Burling is like. He isn't the kind of father a chap could go to when he's in trouble. That's why. And Eric has been spoilt as well. But whose fault is that? Eric's overindulged capitalist lifestyle compared to Eva Smith. He is spoiled. He's been spoiled by his parents. The fact that Mrs. Burling knows nothing about his drinking, but he's given lots of money to go out drinking as well. And, no one has taken him to task on his drinking. It's been this kind of secret in the Burling family that's now come out. But also his life is now spoilt. His son or daughter is dead. He's technically got a criminal record if this goes to trial. And it doesn't within the remit of the play, but would do afterwards. And also, 1912 society. In 6 years' time, World War I starts. Eric would probably be rife for an officer class in World War I. He would probably be an officer. He would probably die in World War I, if he's serving on the active front or, during World War II as well. His life has been spoilt, the kind of deeper meaning of the word spoilt. Then it comes to light that obviously the inspector found out about this from Mrs. Burling. And Eric's speech, "You killed her. You killed her, the child you've had two, my child, your own grandchild, you killed them both." Mrs. Burling is distressed. She's forced to confront her responsibility, not by the inspector, but by her own son. And she is distressed, and it's important that she feels this way in a couple of pages' time once the inspector goes and the family are there unpicking their guilt, when actually they should be focusing on what they've done and their responsibility. And the inspector stops their bickering here. And he goes around the table. "Each of you helped to kill her. Remember that. Never forget it. But I don't think you ever will." He doesn't actually legally punish them. And I think the question is, does he need to? Obviously, Eric is the one who's committed a legal crime. And the crime he would be probably most likely to be punished for is stealing the money. Everything else is a moral crime. So technically, he can't punish them. But I don't think he needs to punish them. It's this idea that you need to face what you've done is a form, that recognition of doing wrong is a form of punishment in itself to a lot of people. If someone tells me I have done something wrong, I'd be mortified. I would look at myself and, I need to make sure I don't do that again. We are human, and sometimes facing up to the consequences or taking responsibility for what you've done is an effective form of punishment. Sometimes saying sorry is an effective form of punishment when you mean it and you're making a commitment to change that. So the inspector doesn't punish any of them. But this idea that he doesn't actually need to. And he goes through the family, just used her for the end of a stupid drunken evening, as if she was an animal, a thing, not a person. This is Eric's involvement there. The entire family treat her like that, to be honest, but it's interesting that the male characters do, Gerald and Eric in particular treat her like a thing. They objectify her. They turn her into an object there. Burling, "Look, Inspector, I give thousands, yes, thousands." This capitalist answer, he's trying to buy his way out of guilt. And he's cut down by the inspector. "You're offering the money at the wrong time, Mr. Burling. He should have done this when she asked for the money." And Burling himself has faced up to his responsibility. "Look, I'd give thousands, yes, thousands," in his own capitalist way. "You can't even say I'm sorry." One Eva Smith has gone, but there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us. The suffering in World War One and World War Two, the millions and millions and millions of people who die in war. The Eva Smiths and John Smiths. Is Eva Smith more than one person, representative of the entire working class? Is she an every woman character or an every man character in theatre, a character who is supposed to represent the entirety of the working class? A lot of students waste their time worrying about whether she's real or not. And the family do this in a couple of pages where we never saw the same photo at the same time. It doesn't matter. They all did something. They've all confessed publicly in front of the theatre, to an inspector, to doing something wrong. They all did something to someone. And that's what Priestley wants them to do. Face up to what you've done to that one person. We are members of one body. We're responsible for each other. That we are responsible for each other. There's not a lot of language analysis there. That's the key theme for Inspector Calls. That's what Priestley wants you to take away. We are all responsible for each other. We are the bees in the hive. We look after each other. We are part of one body. And if you can't learn it, they'll be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. World War One and World War Two. The death, the bombing, the destruction to life, completely unnecessary. This idea and the suffering, the anger. If you won't learn it, if you won't be like Eric and Sheila are, once the inspector disappears and you learn your lesson, then you have to be taught it. This is why we have punishment systems in school. This is why we have behaviour management systems in school. If you can't learn your lesson, we teach you how to behave. And if you won't learn your lesson, Burling family, people in the audience, capitalists in society, everyone, then somebody or something will come along and teach you that lesson. Whether it's an inspector, whether it's a real inspector or not, something will force you to face up to that, whether it's war, whatever it is. So this is Priestley's key message. The inspector is Priestley's mouthpiece. This is his key message. Fire and blood and anguish is a key quotation. We're responsible for each other. And if you don't learn that lesson, if you don't take on board what's happened in this play, if you leave the theatre, oh, so what, it doesn't matter, what's he going on about, cranks and all that nonsense, then something or someone will come along and teach you that. And Priestley is referencing those real world events of World War One and World War Two. So the inspector leaves, and the Burling family are there fighting each other apart. Burling only cares about his knighthood and the fact he's not going to get that. He's still talking about his reputation. Eric challenges his parents. I'm ashamed of you. Yes, both of you. And Mr. Burling is ashamed of Eric. I don't blame you. So Eric starts to take responsibility. Sheila has already started to take responsibility, and it's now the other characters, it's for them to kind of fight about, and as Priestley said, to learn your lesson or be taught your lesson. So we're talking about the public scandal, and then Sheila starts, is that when the inspector came, just after father had said this, just at his proudest, the moment of his most hubristic self, where he's being selfish, he's talking about his capitalist ideals. And this idea, the seed is sown that he's not a real police inspector. This is a key quotation. It doesn't matter if he's real or not. The inspector's role in the play is the voice of Priestley, or the voice of socialism. He was our police inspector, all right. Please don't bog yourself down worrying about whether he's real or not. Just worry about the fact that whoever it was, somebody came and made them confess to what they had done publicly, which is important, because you can learn from that. If you confess to something, you can learn from that and put it right. Or not, as the family don't do. And they start unpicking this thread of the fact that he's real and whether it makes a difference. Of course it doesn't make a difference, because they still did what they did, and Eric and Sheila recognise they still did what they did. And this idea, he can't do anything to your mother and Sheila and me, except perhaps makes us look a bit ashamed of ourselves in public, but as for you, he can ruin you, you know. The aggressive language that Mr. Burling was critical of the inspector for using in Act 1, he's now using to his own son. He's not the type of chap, so he's not the type of father a chap can turn to, Mr. Burling. He's aggressive. He treats his son horrendously here. And this idea, he made us confess, whether he's a realistic inspector or a socialist or some sort of crank. So, Gerald re-enters, and then Gerald forwards the theory that he's not a police officer. Gerald spoke to a police sergeant down the road, said there hadn't been an Inspector Gould there at all. Burling confirms it by ringing Colonel Roberts. the idea there being no Inspector Gould on the police force, and this idea these are hoax. Now, obviously, it could be a new arrival, it could be somebody who they don't know on the police force, just because you've asked one person, the chief colonel, but it could be someone from another agency. It could be that it's not a real inspector, but the point is, don't get too worried about that. The fact is, a construct, because they're not real people, they're characters, a construct, the inspector, the voice of socialism, the voice of Priestley, has forced all these characters to confess publicly to what they've done. And this Mrs. Burling and Gerald are bandied together. They're not the older generation. You've got two older characters and one younger character. They are the capitalists of the play, in its case of few. He's not real, so we don't need to worry about it. And Sheila, I suppose we're all nice people now, bitterly. She's sarcastic. This idea that she has learnt from this, but the other characters haven't. And they're arguing about this, and they're still going through. And Eric, this girl's still dead, isn't she? I take some interest in it. I take too much. This idea. Burling interest, obviously a financial term, but the interest here is the interest of the dead girl and Eric's son, who is in theory dead as well. And Eric takes charge here, takes responsibility. I did what I did, Mother did what she did, and the rest of you did what you did to her. That's really important. And they have an argument here, a heated argument. Eric shouts, I say the girl's dead and we all helped to kill her and that's what matters. He's not half shy, half assertive now. He's assertive. He's asserted himself over his father for a force of good. We've all done this wrong. And Burling responds by shouting back, threatening Eric, threatening his own son here, who is trying to get to the truth and trying to make his parents realise. They won't be told. Stop shouting or get out. And Eric, I don't give a damn now whether I stay here or not. We'll unpick that later on because it's important, Sheila's response at the end, whether they would realistically leave or not. And then they get to the idea that it's not a real girl. We've no proof it was the same photograph, and it's Gerald who puts forward this theory. And this idea there being more different girls. So what they decide to do is ring the infirmary to see if somebody has arrived dead. Interestingly, they ring the infirmary. And what's really interesting about this, first of all, is they have spent, goodness me, I'm just going back through the book. They have spent now from page 57 to page 70, so around about 13 pages of the play, trying to work out that he's not a real inspector and nobody really died. Rather than reflecting on their own roles in this, rather than going away independently and coming to terms with this, rather than going to the police, in Eric's case, they're all trying to get themselves out of this situation rather than taking responsibility, apart from Eric and Sheila. So Gerald rings the infirmary to see if somebody's been brought in for committing suicide. There's a really brilliant moment, if you get to watch this live, not on in the theatres, where obviously as he waits, the others show their nervous tension. This phone call, this waiting, can be dragged on for dramatic effect. And if you drag it on for a couple of minutes, the tension, because this is Burling, Sheila shivers, Eric clasps and unclasps his hand. This tension is key to them all, trying to get away with what they've done. And Burling, the fact that no one's been brought in, whole story's just a load of moonshine, and they give Gerald a drink. But Sheila refuses to accept this, as does Eric. Everything happened. If it didn't end tragically, that's lucky for us. So at least someone hasn't died in their view. But it might have done, and we've all done what we've done. This is a key quotation. By the end of the play, penultimate page now, it frightens me the way you talk. Mr. Burling is mocking his own children, laughing at them for speaking the truth, for being honest, for wanting to look after this woman. Look, you better ask Gerald for that ring you gave back to him. He still sees his daughter as a commodity. The idea that they're right, Gerald has publicly confessed to the inspector, to a theatre full of people, to the characters on the stage, that he has had an affair. Whether they're called Eva Smith, Daisy Renton, whoever it is, he's publicly confessed to that. And now they're behaving as if nothing has happened. And of course, it has happened, even if she hasn't died, even if she has died. So Gerald is still guilty of having an affair. Mr. Burling has still done what he's done. He's let himself off very easily here. And Sheila is right to be frightened. This idea that you've gone through this experience, everyone has done something wrong and you're not learning from this. It's that socialist view of fear of the capitalist world, fear of people not caring about what's happened and what they've done. You've stopped. You're ready to go on in the same old way. They haven't learned their lesson. You began to learn something. If man doesn't learn their lesson, they'll be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. So they began to learn something, and they're ready to go on in the same old way. Fire and blood and anguish, and it frightens me the way you talk, and I can't listen to any more of it. Sheila's now a socialist. She's afraid of their behaviour and the real world consequences that it will have. Gerald, disgustingly, all right now, Sheila, what about this ring? Despite publicly confessing to his fiancée that he's had an affair, they are very, very real, tries to pretend like everything is fine. Obviously, Sheila is confused. It's interesting she doesn't, partly because of the time of the play, outright dismiss this. No, not yet. It's too soon. I must think. She's got to weigh up her future as a woman in Britain of 1912, and the idea that Gerald Croft, the son of Lord and Lady Croft, does represent capitalist growth. He is from a significant financial and social background. And it's this idea that even Sheila, we empathise with Sheila by the end of the play, and Eric, they have learnt from their behaviour. But it's this idea that even Sheila, no, it's not an outright no, it's a not yet, I must think. This idea she's got to weigh up her future as a woman in the Britain of 1912, and this offer from Gerald, even though his behaviour is reprehensible. And they haven't learned their lesson. And just as Mr. Burling was interrupted by the inspector arriving, he is now interrupted by the telephone ringing sharply. They haven't learned their lesson, so they must be taught it. That was the police. A girl has just died. An inspector's on his way to ask some questions. As they stare guiltily and dumbfounded, the curtain falls. Okay, there's a couple of different things then potentially going on by the end. If you're reading Inspector Calls the way the Priestley intends, we feel empathy for Sheila and Eric. Whether they will modify their behaviour, we don't know. This is where the play ends. But they have clearly challenged and taken on board the inspector's socialist message. Mr. Burling, Mrs. Burling and Gerald haven't. They are the voice of capitalism. They do not care or feel the responsibility for their actions. Whether the inspector's real or not, it doesn't matter. They've publicly confessed and they haven't learned their lesson, his final speech. Sheila has given them a warning just here. You haven't learned, you had an opportunity to learn, you've stopped. So if you haven't learned your lesson, you must be taught. And they're taught by the phone call. Whether this is some kind of circular narrative, whether it's another example of dramatic irony, cutting Burling short, whether it's this idea of time lapse, the inspector arriving at a certain point, waiting for facts, somebody not having some information. I think the best way of saying is if you don't learn your lesson, you'll be taught your lesson. And that's what Priestley wants you to feel. They've all done something wrong. They had an opportunity to learn. Eric and Sheila have learned, and the other characters haven't learned. And it ties in with this idea of the inspector being omniscient, all-knowing. He's like the voice of Priestley. He's a proxy for Priestley. He's a godlike figure in that he will challenge the Burlings to confess to what they've done. And so the play ends, and the idea then, the next thing is, what do you do as an audience member? Do you follow the capitalist route of the older Burlings and Gerald and not care about what's going to happen next, not care about your fellow man, dismiss community as nonsense? Or do you take on board the socialist viewpoint and reflect on your own behaviour, learn from your own behaviour in society and be better to challenge that? And also, how do the Erics and Sheilas of the world stand up to the Mr. and Mrs. Burlings and the Geralds of this world? How successful are they, given that Mr. and Mrs. Burling are laughing at their children, mocking their children, dismissing them as being hysterical and overtired here? How do they then challenge, and what does that mean for the future? And of course, the play is written in 1945, set in 1912, the idea being that the Burlings of the world don't learn their lesson, and war teaches them that lesson. Fire and blood and anguish, this idea that you will learn in suffering if you learn no other way. And it's quite a bleak tone to end the play, but it's an incredibly effective device by Priestley, because it's a case of no one is free, everyone will be challenged and forced to reflect on their own behaviour and their own roles in these events.